Number one, thank you all for coming here today and sharing some of your time. I know we all have very busy schedules, and you guys already do a lot of volunteer work for the town. You are, our civic leadership here. Our select board members can, I see a raise of hand, our select board members. Thank you very much. Our planning board members. Awesome. Town meeting members. Awesome. Other. Love it. Awesome. No, you guys are our community leaders, and I so appreciate you guys taking time out of your day. And I'd like to also share my kind of gratitude with our panelists who are here against the wall. I'm very excited that everyone here has a chance to hear from these guys. So from our local hometown guys, Rick Parker, everyone probably already knows Rick, Executive Director of the Chamber of Commerce. Crosby Nordblom, he's representing the Nordblom Company, owner, operator perspective here today. Thank you, Crosby. Chris Steele with EBP Consulting. It's a full-service real estate consulting firm, and Chris also specializes in site selection. So his vantage point, his lens is really from the tenant perspective and in the boardrooms when they're making decisions. Thank you, Chris. And Sandy Silk, who is a professional, who's been a professional in the development world for a long time, even worked on Assembly Square, now it's Assembly Row, but is now working as the VP for real estate development for mass development here in the state of Massachusetts. So thank you, Sandy. And we'll be kicking it off. You'll first hear from Michael O'Leary, Cushman & Wakefield. Michael is obviously here today, not just to participate in the discussion, but also to present a market overview, what the brokers are looking at, what they're seeing in terms of the real data. And Michael has been working in the 128 and 495 area market for over 20 years, and he's the Executive Managing Director of Cushman & Wakefield. So thank you. And is this sounding okay? Is there a little reverb, or is it sounding okay to everyone? Thumbs up. Okay. Okay, with that, what we'll do is start off with a quick slide presentation from Michael's team, and then what we'll do is have our panelists come on board. They all have microphones, and we'll have a discussion, and I'll kind of lead it from there. But I want to just kind of set the framework a little bit before we dive into this. And that's partly because leading up to this conversation today, I've had the privilege of talking to a wide variety of people, not just our panelists, but several property owners in town, several business owners, the assessor. And what we're finding a little bit, and I wanted to use kind of a prop to kind of demonstrate it, is that there are still a lot of good things about Burlington. We have strong fundamentals. We have the location, we have the amenities, we have strong infrastructure, we have a AAA rating, bond rating. But at the same time, what I'm hearing are deals are fragile. It's hard to make a deal. So you have essentially deals are, kind of hard to earn, hard to pencil, whether it's a cost of construction, the investment rate or the interest rates. There are difficulties out there. And what we have, this is probably where I needed a stand, is the tension between the two. So there's real tension between having, strong fundamentals and product, but not having, people there and filling this product up. That's what we're working with. And today, what I think you'll hear is how we can really unpack that and understand more of the nuance that is behind that story and behind that tension. So with that, Michael, I will give it to you so you can do your presentation and talk a little bit about the data and see, and maybe starting to, tease out some of these elements.
So again, Michael O'Leary, Cushman & Wakefield. I've been doing this for a while, and interestingly enough, yesterday was my 23rd anniversary in the business. So an Irishman, Irish Catholic, grew up town over, St. Patty's Day, here I am, 23 years later doing this. But what was interesting, one of the first broker open houses, broker event that I went to way back when, just getting in the business, green as can be, the grand prize was a car. So not strong fundamentals back in 2003. But interestingly enough, a new leasing incentive for the new owners at the Keurig Dr. Pepper building, where they have 153,000 square feet. Any broker that brings a full floor tenant gets a new car, a Rivian. But again, fundamentals were different in 2003 than they were today, significantly. But why don't we dive into the data? I'll be brief, 5 or 6 minutes. If anybody has questions, feel free to ask. Happy to elaborate on any point. So again, how we categorize the Central 128 market: Needham to the south, Burlington to the north. In aggregate, we're approximately 25 million square feet of the office inventory. If you sprinkle in some life science development, flex development, modest industrial development, you're higher than that. But what I was asked to focus on this evening is just the office component. And I think what's important about the slide up here are the two ends of the dumbbell, if you will. You've got Burlington to the north, approximately 6.4 million square feet, and Waltham to the south at 10.3 million square feet. In aggregate, that concentration is 66% of the market. Those two inventory sets control this market. They set the tone. Now, that isn't to suggest there's nothing going on in the other areas, because there is, but when you look at the fundamentals, and the next slide will tell a little bit more, but where we're at today, 16.9% vacancy rate, the average weighted asking rental rate, $45 a square foot gross, again, subjective, that's what our data says. 58 buildings in total. We'll get to the 753,000 square feet of leasing velocity in 25, but you've got negative absorption. Now, this vacancy rate's going to go up in the next 12 months, modestly, maybe 2 or 3 points. Nothing significant, nothing crazy. It's not going to be a 40% vacant market. But if you look in terms of how Burlington compares today, it compares quite well. We're at 16.9% vacancy rate. Waltham in aggregate, 17.7. The overall Central 128 office market, 21.2%, compared to the aggregate Greater Boston office market, which is 199 million square feet, at 24.5%. So from a fundamental standpoint, statistically, we're doing okay. We're doing okay. This is a very interesting slide, and I'm going to dovetail between this slide and a final slide because we can tie a story together. 2025 was a great year, the best year that we've seen in the last 5 years since the pandemic hit. And if you look at the leasing velocity, Burlington did quite well, best year since 22, but where things started to get very interesting is Waltham started to really sing. And a lot of that Waltham activity is based upon lease expiration. Let me go to this slide. This, I think, is the most important slide. Because if I look at 2025, and I understand that in the 26 expirations, those events have already happened. Those happen in 25, which is at 1.4 million square feet approximately of lease expirations. All of those lease expirations happened in 25, hence the higher leasing velocity. If this chart went further back, you can track leasing velocity. So what does it say about 26? Anybody have a guess? I'll answer it. It's going to be a little bit slower. It's going to be a little bit slower in the first half, which we've seen. We've seen the demand basically stabilize. It's not significantly booming. It's not growing. But that's the reason why. Because historically, the Greater Boston suburban office market has been a lease expiration-driven market. I think we've all maybe forgotten the cyclical nature of this business. Whereas if you look at 2017, 2018, 2019, particularly for Burlington, Burlington alone saw the most consecutive quarters of positive absorption than any micro market in Central 128. Some of that's catching lightning in a bottle. Some of that's the story that was told before that happened with amenities, infrastructure, great town. But I think a lot of people have forgotten that it took a while to get there. And the starting point we're at today, we're significantly better than we were 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. So fundamentally, if we look at this chart and everything that we've been saying to clients, see one sitting back there, is the first half of 26 is slow. Second half's going to pick up. But as we get into 2027, 2028, and 2029, we should maintain, if not see, greater leasing velocity in the preceding year than we've seen in what we saw in 2025, because it's all lease expiration driven. That's what this market is. I haven't seen it change dramatically one way or another. We obviously had a life science boom in Greater Boston from 20 to 22, which has grown a life science market to 50 million square feet. However, you got 14 million square feet of vacant inventory as it sits today in the life science market. So lucky for Burlington that you didn't develop 10 million square feet of life science inventory where some other areas in the Commonwealth did. They need to figure out what to do with that. But just some other data points. If we look at the last few years, the major deals that have happened, you've got 3 on the board. Keurig Dr. Pepper, that lease restructure. You've got State Street expanding and extending at the district, and obviously the Microsoft expansion at 5 and 50 in Wayside. The other thing too, if you think about a 16% vacant market, 17% vacant market in Burlington, that's approximately 1 million square feet to absorb. Are you going to get a 1 million square foot user tomorrow? Probably not. Because again, the average size of a tenant in the market today and the average deal size is 15,000 square feet. So it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work with the ownership groups. It takes a lot of work with the actual companies, the tenants. But what I think is fantastic about Burlington is that you're business friendly. And I think a lot of companies and a lot of owners know that. So again, I'm here to present the data. I'm here to present the facts. I'm not here to help solve any problems. Well, I'm not going to solve them for you. I'm certainly here to help and talk to. But again, if anybody has any questions on the data, what we're seeing, more than happy to chat after.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thanks. We're going to conclude this part. So thank you, Michael, very much. And yeah, I'll remind everyone, this is a beginning of our conversation in this. So, more questions might come up, more things that need analysis. So this is just the start. So with that, let's bring up our panelists. Sandy, Chris, Rick, Crosby, and Michael. Do you want to take a seat up there as well? Well, Michael, thank you so much for kind of starting to outline some of the numbers. I think kind of given the overall market kind of data that we're seeing, I'd like to turn kind of the first question over to Chris Steele. And Chris, I'm curious about kind of those numbers and how they kind of relate to the decisions before those turn into numbers, essentially, right? So in the boardroom, as you're sitting there and you're involved in making decisions on locations and where people are looking, what's going on? What are people thinking about before they get to some kind of action, whether it's renewal, new place, or something else?
So one of the key things that you need to keep in mind with any sort of a lease conversation is it's a commitment to a point in time and an amount of space for a period of time, which means that you need to be able to plan a future well enough ahead to be able to feel confident about that kind of a decision. I was just thinking about this, Mike, when you were talking about you've been in the business 23 years. I can remember and we had a big project that we were working on for Cisco Systems back in 1999. We had been doing a global site location project for them where we were helping them figure out which markets to go ahead and take new space in because that was going to be where their new development centers were going to be. And we were into this project for better part of a year, and then all of a sudden the project stopped. They said, hang on, put it on freeze. And then they called us back about a month later and said, okay, project is going forward, but we have a different question for you. Of the offices that we have, where should we consolidate? You have to continue to pay attention to the different things that happen in the marketplace because within different industries, within the economy as a whole, things can shift, they can ebb and flow. We're seeing a big set of changes right now, still coming out of COVID, as well as the economic situation that we're in, where there's a tremendous amount of unsettlement. And as a result of that, the corporations, when you're actually in that conference room and trying to get them to make a decision, they don't feel confident in making decisions, so they're going to defer as long as possible.
So in deferring, I guess what I'm thinking right now is, are they looking at side-by-side comparisons for locations? I think that's what we've gotten a lot about, because when we hear and when we've talked to people in Burlington, we've heard about some of the challenges, whether it's remote work, whether it's generally pruning back cost-conscious companies. But when you're putting locations side by side, a lot of people here want to know what gets Burlington knocked off that list.
So I'll give you the very quick, 30-second, here's how a site selection project actually goes. You start with the first phase where it's us as the consultants in the room acting more or less as therapists for the different decision makers that are there. What problem are we trying to solve? What is the range of outcomes that could possibly be there? What are the things that need to be in place? What are the like-to-haves? Then you go from there to a long list. Where are the locations in the world that meet those basic thresholds, that are the basic things that could be under consideration? So that could be a global search, could be a regional search, could be a national search. It really depends upon the business and the problem they're trying to solve. From there, we get to a point where we start to continually cull the list. We make it smaller and smaller until it's actually manageable. The old saying in site selection is we don't pick a location, we carve off the ones that don't work. It's all about managing risk. At a certain point, we get to a short list where we run out of data. And that's when we call Melissa and say, hey, listen, congratulations. We've got Project X that's actually looking around. I want to tell you that Burlington's made the list. By the way, if you could do a site list, if you could do a site visit for us tomorrow and actually set it up so that we could meet 16 companies and look at 10 buildings, that'd be great.
Right? And that's when I would probably call on Crosby or some of the other property owners here in the room too and say, hey, they have, we have a client looking for X number of square footage. And so maybe with that, maybe I'll toss it to Crosby. So now you have the product that's available. Can you maybe explain to us what your thinking is and your investors and how you're positioning that product to make it desirable for an entity that's interested?
Yeah, and it depends on the project itself, right? There's a variety of different tenants, a variety of different needs, and so we're fortunate that we have a little bit of a portfolio, as others do, in the Burlington area. And so it's really what building is the right fit, right? If they're a Class A office tenant, right, then you're going to focus, as we were up at Blue Sky the other day with the large amenities package. Mm-hmm. If it's an HR-driven exercise, then you're probably going to look at those types of investments, those types of assets, right? If they're more focused on the utility side of things, if they need power, if they need loading, then you may focus on different assets. So it's really understanding what the requirement is and how to best fit it into a box at the end of the day. And obviously economics come into play, so it's trying to figure out what's the right asset for this group, and does it exist within our portfolio.
Okay, so since we're talking about kind of office, I'm going to toss this to Sandy, thinking not necessarily, the office specifically, but trying to think of contextually, right? So you're, curating a space for the client's list, but then what kind of office has been working? What's the context for places that have been thriving since you've been looking around in Massachusetts more and you've developed different types of projects over time?
I would say one of the key things that we think really makes for a vibrant office environment is vibrant amenities around, and having a mix of uses, which doesn't work always adjacent to big industry or a big industrial project, but really can work adjacent to a Class A building, where you're trying to leverage residential population and employment population to serve and really create the demand for a restaurant, a coffee shop, a dry cleaner, the kinds of things that your employees really want to have accessible and your residents also want to have accessible. So before I wore the current hat I'm wearing at Mass Development, I spent years as a multifamily developer, and we often looked at properties that were we actually looked at several properties in the Waltham area not too long ago that were slated for life science that were then being looked at for multifamily. I think there's going to be more of that happening around where Class C and kind of more outdated, obsolete buildings start to want to turn over to something else. And that ability to mix the uses is helpful. It reduces traffic when people can live across the street or down the street from where they're working. It also provides these amenities. And I can't stress enough how important these amenities are. I live in Brookline. I sit on the Economic Development Board in Brookline, and we talk a lot about the importance of what the brokers there refer to as daytime pop, so daytime population. Because if you want to have these vibrant neighborhood amenities, you need the daytime population that comes from vibrant workplaces to feed it and make them more viable. And Burlington, I would just add, has so much going for it that if you can leverage what your assets are, and that's what we talk a lot about at Mass Development, how do we help a community leverage their existing assets and create more?
I love that, Sandy, because we've talked a lot about that, enhancing kind of what you've got. We have a lot of amenities. We do have the restaurant, we have the things that people are looking for in terms of the office market. But it's still, as we saw from Michael's slide, I think noted, the net absorption, that was one of the statistics that he had up there, is lower. So I think one question I have, maybe back to Michael a little bit, and then I want to weave in Rick too, because Rick has seen boots on the ground, understands the daytime population. But I guess two points I want to make and kind of bring it back to you guys. From my understanding of the data, when the renewals happen, maybe when these lease rollovers happen, sometimes they move out, sometimes they lease a little smaller space. But we still have the amenities. We have that strong foundation. So maybe Rick, can you speak to what you're hearing from the businesses, particularly in Burlington, with regard to, the good things we have and then the challenges that, they are describing to you?
Yeah, certainly. And it's nice to hear that the therapist gets involved at the first steps. I will assure you those tasks don't go away once they're here. The daytime population, or what we call BIS, backsides and seats, the amenities that grew here grew as a result of companies locating here. And in an effort to keep them here, all of these restaurants and the amenities came in. For the past 5 years, the number one question I would get is, when are they coming back? When can we expect them to be back, and when will things get back to the normal? I think people are now starting to understand that work from home is something that's going to take quite a long time to get over. And the question is now evolved to, how can I look at my profitability and costs in a manner that I can control some of them? Cost of labor have gone up, cost of goods, energy, and now real estate is one of the things that used to be seen as one of those things that you couldn't change. But with the market now, with so many other options, a lot of these businesses are looking at, what can I do? Can I downsize? Can I look at another municipality that may be offering, some deals? The market is really competitive, and it's competitive to our tenants. There are people from outside that come and talk to them on a regular basis. Certainly, a restaurant is not going to downsize, and in many cases, they won't move on. But the amenities that have built and made Burlington what it is today are struggling. Profitability is a main concern. Busyness does not equal profitability. So don't think because you're waiting an hour to get into a restaurant that their bottom line is good. So they are looking at real estate being a variable cost now, and maybe they can make a move. So we try to make sure that they look at what's available here in Burlington first.
That makes a lot of sense. I think I'm hearing that kind of across the board too, that even with the deals that are being made, that are bringing in a daytime population, my understanding is that the leases are fragile. So that there are a lot of tenant concessions, meaning 6 months free, or you have to do some improvements in the building to get that tenant inside the building. And they have to pay the broker. That's part of it. So that net effective rent is actually a lot more thin than it had been. Even though that we have the leasing, the actual leasing occurring at the velocity, that it might be thinner. And I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit, Michael.
Yeah, and it's no surprise, right? I mean, Rick, you said it's a competitive market out there. And when you think about the geography that the competitive market spans, probably 15 miles. So for a lot of these companies, which are big global companies, 15 miles isn't that big of a difference. And when you start to furthermore evaluate the employee demographics of the employers, there's a lot of flexibility that they can have. So, and again, from an ownership side, everybody wants to lease vacant space. Get me new tenants. Steve Duffy said, when are you going to get this space leased? All the time. Yeah, we're getting there. We got one. But to shift the mindset, particularly in a competitive landscape and competitive market, is how do I retain my tenants? How can I hedge my risk? How can I stabilize my net operating income? Because if you're able to do that successfully, you can offer significant concessions to the tenant base. But again, I would ask Crosby as well, with some of the larger blocks at Blue Sky, you get some pretty good looks, and some of the deal terms that can be thrown out there are significant. So from an actual penciling out, Crosby, it'd be fantastic to hear how you would underwrite, look at, communicate internally on how these deals pencil out, because it is. I've never seen concessions in a 23-year span as I've seen today between free rent, tenant improvements,
Right.
is in rent structure,
And I can give an example that I've seen directly. We have R.J. Kelly, also a local property owner, has a wide portfolio, and they had, I think, at Boston Scientific Systems come in, and they specifically had said that they're able to do that and charge a lower rent, do a lease that is very accommodating to make sure they have bodies in their building. So now I don't know the financing personally of that, but I know that helps to make it competitive. And we do have, different property owners that have different makeups. Partly why I wanted to unpack this a little bit, because maybe Crosby, you can kind of speak to that. But then there's other people like Piedmont. Piedmont Properties, they have properties nationally. They have a few here in Burlington, they have Atlanta. Their Sunbelt stuff is off the hook compared to what we have going on here. So maybe if, Crosby, you're in that world, can you kind of help articulate that for us and help us understand?
Yeah, and it depends on the asset. It depends on the ownership, right? A big piece is for folks that bought property a handful of years ago and levered it up based on a high valuation. They're going to be highly constrained as to what they can do because they need the property to be valued at least what the loan balance is and hopefully getting a return above that. So there are certainly assets that are constrained from that perspective. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost is basis, and then it comes down to how many of these deals can you do? And certainly for a larger tenant, you know, the phrase that we use is it's a problem solver. If mm-hmm. you have a 100,000 square foot building and there's a 100,000 square foot tenant, mm-hmm. then you're going to be able to justify much more aggressive terms if they're signing a 10, 15-year lease, because you can see your way through that, what may be a lower face rent at first, but you make it up over time. Versus if you have a vacant building and it's 100,000 square feet, to get really aggressive for 10,000 square feet is much more challenging because it's going to take you quite a bit longer to fill that building based on 10,000 feet. But it depends on the asset too. You know, you have buildings like Cummings purchased a property up in Bedford, mm-hmm. right?
Right. You want to tell everyone what that one was?
Yeah, so it's the, forgive me, it's 174 Middlesex in Bedford. It's the old RSC
Cummings
campus.
might be here.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So they bought it for probably $90+ million 12, 15 years ago. Just sold to Cummings at an auction for, I think, $5+ million. So they have a lot of flexibility to do really low rents, really cheap deals. And so there's a bit of bifurcation in the market. There are some, everyone wants a good deal, right? And there are some tenants that say, give me the cheapest rent possible. I don't care where it is. I want the cheapest rent possible.
Yes.
And then there are others that say, I want to be in the nicest space. Yes. And so I think what leases and what doesn't and kind of how you make it pencil highly depends on the product type. Right.
Well, that's really interesting because I know a lot of people hear the themes flight to quality, and that's like, oh, well, everyone's getting the nicer space, so only Class A is working. But then on the flip side, we have heard exactly like the cost consciousness of some of the companies as they're kind of pruning back and giving the kind of other costs related to operating a business. So that seems to track a lot. I guess with that, Chris, is that what you're hearing in terms of, you know, the cost, the impact on some of the decisions being made?
I mean, sure. Every location decision is going to be a solution to a business problem. One of the things that we've been hearing, both from our clients as well as from some of the other real estate folks that we talk to, is there is I don't want to call it a flight to quality so much as taking advantage of an opportunity. Particularly as some of those current tenants are downsizing or they're coming to the end of their leases and they're coming up and there's not necessarily the market behind them. Some folks are actually taking the chance to go ahead and jump into some of that space because it actually buys them other opportunities in terms of more amenities, more ability to hold on to workforce, get the workforce to come back to the office.
Right. For all
of that. But there are just as many that are actually taking a look at the other end of that, which are they themselves are facing their certain kinds of cost pressure, and they are not as, for example, AHR driven or something else, so they're taking advantage of the other ends of the curve.
And then, I mean, Rick, I'll give you an opportunity to add to that if there's, you know, something specific when you're kind of hearing from the business community, maybe if someone exits Burlington, is that part of it? Because I know from different, you know, stakeholders, you know, taxes is part of this equation as they're thinking about costs, as they're considering moving to Burlington, and hey, Burlington has high taxes, and you have a split tax rate, and you guys should figure that out before, you know, if you're all going to be vacant. That's kind of, you know, all the word on the street, doomsday. But like those are things that people kind of talk about, and let's be candid. We're here to talk about this as civic leaders. So, right.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on that. As a recovering town meeting member and a lifelong resident, we realize as residents that we've had a pretty good deal. The commercial taxes have paid roughly 2/3 of the freight here. The good news is other towns like Wilmington and Billerica are raising their rates, not that they're a major competitor to us, but the truth is with people leaving, and we talk about vacancies, and we talk about sales of buildings that are selling for less than they're valued at. The valuations and the taxes all tie together. And there's only one place for it to go if it starts to shrink in the commercial side, and that's the residential side. Unfortunately, I wear both of those hats. I represent the businesses trying to keep it as fair as possible, but I'm also a resident and very sensitive to people that have been here for a long time. And when that shift comes, they're going to ask all of us, how did this happen and what are we doing about it? So this is the beginning of a discussion that will continue to go. But we have to be ready for it. We are in such a competitive market right now that we have to have other things. And when you said, what are you hearing when they leave? Usually I hear, let go of my leg, Rick, I'm gone, as they drag away. We don't hear much after they're gone. But keep in mind that people do talk outside of the market too. If they had a good experience, they're here. If they had a bad experience or found a better experience somewhere else, they share that too. We're not just here in our own little bubble, but it is just so competitive out there that we've got to do everything we can to be as competitive as possible.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. Sandy.
I was just going to add that I think you're right. And this is the time really to be thinking big picture about where do you want to be 10 years from now, right? 10 years from now, you don't want to look back and say, oh, the market was shifting and we were just holding on to what it used to be and kept playing by the same playbook. You want to really dig deep and look and say, what do we need to maintain this commercial vibrancy? I look at Burlington and I compare it to Brookline in the sense of Brookline's got this great, very hyper-local community retail cores, which are the envy of many kind of close-in suburbs. But we don't have the same commercial assets that you all do, but you've got this amazing commercial assets and this huge regional destination and the mall that's really developed around it and this great dining scene. The more you can support that and support it with additional housing as well, because one of the things that we're hearing employers really talking about a lot is the lack of housing of various types and price points to support their workforce. And the more you become full service and are providing all the things that they need in one place, even though Massachusetts is much more fungible than a place like Texas where the cities are much more spread out, et cetera. But I've been preaching to the choir in Brookline, like, we need more commercial because we need people to be spending money in Brookline so it stays. And so for you in Burlington, you want your dollars to stay here, right? So if you're working with your residents so that they have a great coffee shop, I pick on the coffee shop a lot, but that great coffee shop that also supports the office workers and the industrial workers who are here, then that's a virtuous cycle. And so I would just really encourage you to think about where you want to go, not where you were. Because if you're looking in the rearview mirror, that's done, right? The world has changed. We've all been talking about return to the office, and it's not going to happen, right? And so it's more about figuring out, okay, well, what does the world look like if it doesn't happen? And how do we position ourselves so 10 years from now, everybody's saying, wow, Burlington did it. They got it together and they thought about the future rather than thinking about how we hang on to the past.
Thank you, Sandy. Michael, did you have something? You were good with that. Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about, you talk about an 18-hour community. And then Sandy, do you want to explain a little bit of how you define that? I know it's supportive and I understand, but for everyone here.
An 18-hour community is basically that there's places for people to go and eat out and entertain themselves, et cetera, from pretty much 7, 8 a.m. until 10 o'clock at night, right? That it's full service, right? The town doesn't shut down at 6 p.m. when all the workers leave. And my husband works at the Burlington Mall. Melissa knows this well. So I know that there's thriving business and people are doing well in this area. Because whenever I go to meet him for dinner, it takes a long time to get into the restaurant. So you've got this pull, and it is already 18 hours in many ways, but does that 18-hour environment exist exist beyond Middlesex Turnpike? Is it existing in your neighborhoods so that, you know, people have a neighborhood place? And unfortunately, I don't know Burlington as well as my other colleagues up here on the panel, but, you know, if that's missing from your particular neighborhood, what do you need to do to support that? Because that's also, that holds on to property value on both sides, the commercial
On both sides.
and the residential. And that, again, kind of goes to, there are opportunities around to look at, the flight to quality is just as important on the office side as it is on the retail side, right? And so when you think about the future, think about how these things are all connected.
I often say the virtuous cycle, right? So yeah, there's a lot here, you know, from what we're seeing. So I'll just kind of take a brief moment, because from kind of the data we're seeing on vacancies, the absorption, the future lease rolls, there is some, you know, either reason to be concerned or really motivate to be proactive, work on business retention, you know, touch base with our businesses. That's one thing I'm hearing, you know, through this is a step that, you know, maybe the town and chamber can work on. I think I want to go back to this kind of tension that I mentioned at the beginning, because when, you know, Sandy says these really like complimentary things about the community and how strong it is as a regional draw, we still know on the flip side, it's very competitive. And if Crosby, can I ask you a little bit to share that one story that you told us on the prep meeting about, I think it was 20,000 square feet. It was a smaller company, but then it was very much courted. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll look at Michael's Welch's. So we were looking at Welch's relocating from Concord, and they looked at a couple different locations, including Burlington, including Waltham, and 40,000 feet, some odd. And the amount of competition for these types of tenants, whether it's 20 or 40,000 feet, is enormous. You know, there are a lot of landlords that are sending out proposals unsolicited, saying, I heard this tenant was out in the market, let's just go see if we can get their attention. And that's not always been the case over time, that there have been periods where a 20,000 foot tenant isn't really that big of a deal. Let's go focus on the 100, 200,000 square foot users. But those bigger users are the whales out in the world, and there's really not many of them. So just the amount of competition that you have to go through just to get those, you know, mid-sized companies is really challenging. And as Michael noted, the concessions even for those types of tenants are quite considerable.
Yeah, and they're smaller, like you said. They might not have, the term might not be as long, or the square footage might not be as big. So, I mean, I think those are pieces of the story that we have to continue to tease up to understand the longer kind of commercial narrative. I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. I had a question all teed up and I lost my train of thought. So we were talking about Welch's and we were talking about the smaller pieces. And at least at this point, you know, maybe Michael, could you talk a little bit about some of the kind of the stories that you've heard, I guess, when people are coming to Burlington, what beyond the amenities, other than the packages, is there anything else we're missing at this point? Is it, you know, sometimes I hear, you know, the zoning. We might not have the right zoning in place, or this guy left because he couldn't do this. I know, you know, our planning teams here, we had the Piedmont has a property on Burlington Mall Road, and they were looking to develop. They couldn't get the parking, and they couldn't get I think they also had a use that is not really desirable in that area, like a drive-through. But, you know, it's good to know, you know, what didn't work, right? So I feel like I want to hear maybe from this group, are there things on the land use policy that we should know about?
It's a good question. And I think the simple answer is it depends. I mean, every asset's incredibly different. Every project's different. Every building's different. No two things are the same. But when I think about Burlington, when you think about where it really started, at least in my lifetime, where it really started to work on the commercial side was the announcement of a TIF, right? A competitive TIF, competitive landscape. And I think it was an incredible move because, as Crosby noted, these whales don't come along every so often. If you've got a 200,000 square foot building, maybe you get a full building tour 2 to 3 times a year. And in this competitive landscape, Burlington offered something that no other municipality came out and talked about. Try getting a TIF in Waltham.
Is it hard?
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. But what was really interesting with the announcement of that was a big sale of a project in Burlington, which got a lot of press. But there was a lot of press about Burlington leading up to that sale, which what it really described was superior infrastructure and life beyond 9 to 5. And yeah, it was a little bit of lightning in a bottle. And so many things were captured from that, and that's why you did see such success between 2017 and 2019. It was based upon the fundamentals that exist. But to bring it back, so if you think about what can we do now, how can we get ahead of a possible issue? You guys are talking about it, which is 90% of the battle, because none of the other competitive landscapes really are talking about it right now. So the fact that we're here, it's great. And I would say being proactive isn't something that happens dramatically well in the Central 128 market. And you guys are doing it, but it's flexibility. And it's going to be flexibility with attracting talent and companies, retaining them. But I think you have to look to the commercial base. What type of flexibility, and Rick, you touched on it a little bit. What type of flexibility can we as a town provide our commercial base to be successful for the future? Because the one thing I know is that if you got a 30-year-old office building, it's probably not going to be an office building.
Yes. Yeah, partly one, yes, I agree in terms of the flexibility, and I don't know, Crosby, if you can maybe expand a little bit, or if I pull on that thread a little bit of what flexibility means from an owner and who's trying to, has assets that are, some of them are older, some of them are newer, so maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to understanding the bones of these buildings. And we've looked at buildings recently, in the last couple of months, up north on Route 3 and Bill Ricca on 495, that you get these buildings that 4 or 5 story office buildings that are vacant. It's one of those things that ideally you'd be able to repurpose these things, but in certain areas, as you were saying, it's not amenitized, and there's not really a reason for this building to exist anymore. And so there are certainly some instances where these buildings they're redundant. They're ready to be repurposed and reused in certain circumstances. But that's not always the case, that you can have 2-story office buildings that, lo and behold, 40 years ago was developed for a telecom company, and it has enormous amount of power and heavy floor loads, and by studying those things, you can uncover that this is a great opportunity to bring in an R&D makerspace, 3D printer, whoever it is. And then there are other cases where you have an office building that's relatively leased and blue sky, which is thankfully relatively healthy, and it makes sense to invest in those improvements. So there's a real calculus of understanding what is this building, what can it be used for. There are cases where it needs to be completely repurposed. But there are certainly cases where you look at investing more money into it to capture those users. But it depends on a variety of factors at the end of the day.
I'd like to ask a little bit of kind of what I've heard, through conversations, both in our community and in other locations like, NIOP. So we hear with that, occasionally there's, what's happening is, an economics term, creative destruction. There's going to be pain because there is things are evolving. That's innovation, that's capitalism, and then out comes of it something new a little bit. So some people will say, well, that's really, that's the development world. They took the risk to buy the building at a high price that's going to reset, and, maybe it is vacant for a while. I want to see if one of you could kind of expand how that is, just to make it explicit and how that impacts the town. That might be a good question for our town administrator, really. But thinking about, here are the values. Maybe it's just the investors that need to really worry about it as things are resetting. But what I'm trying to get at is it actually affects the whole, because it's a holistic problem. And maybe, Rick, do you want to take that? Because you've been on town meeting, you've seen both sides, and I think you know where I'm going with that.
Yeah, I think valuation is everything. And there's a lot of factors that go into valuation. If somebody made a mistake and the building was built at a time that it shouldn't have been built and it softens the market, everything goes down. But reputation, to kind of pull it back to the previous topic, reputation is everything. And it's not the reputation that we put on our websites. It's what did the last person that was there, good or bad, what was their experience? A great example, the restaurant community here, everyone knows that it's a very competitive landscape for restaurants. But there's a relationship in the hospitality industry. They ask each other, hey, we're thinking of going into Burlington. What was your experience? What process did you go through? Did you go through a special permit process? How was that? What was the period of time? What's labor like? What is transportation like? What is housing like? It all falls together, and I think Burlington scores very high in a lot of these categories. Transportation is not one of them. Housing is not one of them. And if they have another market that they could be going to right now that can solve those problems, and they start putting more density into an area, then the amenities come. And then you find people shifting from being in your community to someone else's community. So it's that reputation. How are we doing a good enough job as organizations that support businesses and as a town in welcoming them and really meaning it? And so when they leave, they say, you know what, that was a great experience. I'd love to pass the torch to somebody else to come in. So reputation is huge.
Thank you, Rick. So yeah, I think that's what, there's definitely the word of mouth and kind of the reputation of the process and so forth. The other elements that, what we feel are kind of fundamentals, clustering, things like that. I think when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, just kind of where the risk lies when I initially asked that question. If the values are going down, it's not just the investors' issue to deal with, right? It will be our or any municipality that has a makeup of 6.6 million square feet of office, then 3 million square feet of retail, then another 1.2 million square feet of life office. Those are big chunks that we do have to monitor and understand the dynamic, because those obviously pay about 68% of our taxes and our services in town. And you guys know that, but I think part of it is this, to make sure that this discussion kind of does the figure eight to understand how it works backwards for Burlington and our operations. So I just probably wanted to say that out loud. The other thing I wanted to bring up, because and then we're going to get into Q&A shortly here, but we have kind of two more elements or two more chapters of this discussion, is the Q&A, and then a little bit more on the solutions and ideas for being proactive. So those are the two things I want to get to. But with that, I think it was Michael that you had mentioned about New England Executive Park way back when, and that this was before COVID, but they had done a push. And it reminds me of some of the things you're talking about, whether it's word of mouth, whether it's promoting the TIP, or TIF, the tax increment financing agreements that we have control over locally. It's about getting the word out. It's almost like a classic marketing. You can have a great product, but if no one knows about it, and this tax piece, because I've heard it here and there. we do have higher taxes, but what do you get for it, right? What are the benefits of locating here with the taxes as they are? You know, we have amenities, access to talent, good roads. Now we have great water, and we are working on our energy, meaning the substation Eversource has been talking about. So those are really good things that are underpinning the kind of the growth that we can see into the future. But if you wouldn't mind to talk a little bit about that executive park story, because I felt like there was some like elevation or awareness that was developed.
I mean, candidly, you know, I think our collective team just kind of spread the word. We didn't invest any of our own capital into it. It was the ownership that did it. But they put a tremendous amount of capital in the redevelopment of former New England Executive Park, now the district. And it took some time. But when, again, things started getting off the ground, it was just within the brokerage community, which the town of Burlington should absolutely utilize to spread words. And I think the TIF was a prime example of that way back when. But with the demand where it was at the particular time, we created a competitive environment to be within the city and the city, which kind of captured everything Sandy said. Like, it's an 18-hour day, life beyond 9 to 5. You can get your workout in, you get your coffee, you can stay at the hotel, and then you can go to a number of 6 different restaurants.
Yeah, I'm just as curious. Anyone remember that transition here for the district? Just raise your hand. And similarly, Third Ave. Anyone kind of remember that transition, industrial park? So yes, and part of it's kind of a branding.
Yeah, I mean, it's branding, but it was absolutely 1,000% on the coattails of the branding that came along with Burlington in the preceding years.
Mm-hmm. A combination.
Which we've already talked about. Mm-hmm. But again, like if you think about that experience and the run that it's been, I think you'd be naive that it's going to be consistent throughout. Things are going to have to change. Within that project, any large project, variety of use is one of the biggest strong suits that we have in the greater Boston market. And particularly where Burlington sits, you know, to the north, you've got fantastic labor force. You've got fantastic labor force in southern New Hampshire. You've got advanced manufacturing. You've got high tech, clean tech, life science. The variety of use ecosystem that we have in greater Boston is ultimately the lifesaver. So when you look at a 20, 30, 40-year-old office building, how should that be repurposed? And if, I'll throw it out there because I'm sure people are going to want to talk about it, what can be repurposed to multifamily?
Oh, office. Oh, yes. We'll get into we'll transition right now and with that question, okay, Michael?
Drop that bomb
because that
right
is a
now.
great question. We'll go into a Q&A, and I know some people have already asked me that, and you pulled data for it, at least for the greater Boston. I have some data for, Riley did. Riley pulled the data. But, you know, how common is this office to resi conversion? How many buildings in the greater Boston has that actually happened to? Fully, Riley gave us a number of 23 buildings in greater Boston. So there are few and far between. I think, Sandy, you might be able to give us some of the background dynamics on, is that reasonable? What should we expect? Or is it just old buildings going to turn to residential? That's the only thing.
So I would say there's, to make a distinction, there is the actual kind of conversion of an existing building where you're really using the footprint and the skeleton and, you know, taking the shell of that building and converting it to resi, which is really hard to do. Residential wants to be 70 feet deep. It doesn't want to, and a lot of office, especially office buildings that were built in the 70s and 80s, have these super large floor plates that really don't lend themselves to office or to residential conversion. But what they do lend themselves to is coming down and having the entire site be repositioned into residential. And so it's really twofold, I would say. And, you know, it's why, you know, 15 years ago, you saw so many old mill buildings across the state be converted to residential because the floor plate was appropriate for that, right? And I've sat, as wearing my residential developer hat, I've sat in many, many, many meetings and panels and whatnot where people talk about the fact that you're not really saving any money converting a building, but it's a little more sustainable, and I put that in quotes because there's a lot of deconstruction that goes into it. So it's not simple, and it doesn't mean that every building that is, office building in particular, that is obsolete has a new life as a residential building. I'll get on my little soapbox for a minute.
Okay, I'll allow it. And then think of your next question, then I will get
But
to
I
you.
do think it's really important for communities like Burlington to be really hyper objective and almost and super diligent about and honest about which office buildings that are challenging to lease up, that maybe aren't in the best location, that are dated. Really, what does that office building look like 20 years from now? And does it have a life as office 20 years from now? So should we be encouraging that owner to start thinking about the next life of that building? And there's the investment value of the building that's a critical component of that. What I haven't seen yet is any community, and this doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it just means I'm not aware of it, really incentivizing people to take that leap and move the property to its next life. Because it becomes a drain for the town, and I think, Rick, you were talking about this a little bit, it becomes blight, right, when nobody's paying attention to it, and an eyesore, and then it becomes a little bit of a drag on the tax rolls, et cetera. And I was at a panel this morning about the Star Market site in Winter Hill in
Oh, right.
which I know you know about. And the thing that unlocked the box for that project to move forward, which is 100% housing now, was a TIF, that they got 100% tax abatement for 20 years, that the developer valued at something like $20 million, and they've agreed to hold the current tax rate, which is $79,000. So there's a big give on the city of Somerville's part, but in exchange, they got a significant amount of affordable housing, and they got this blighted property that has been holding back this entire neighborhood in Somerville to be transformed.
Yeah,
And
I think that property was vacant for how long?
I think 20 years.
It was so for context, that in particular was a vacant grocery store site for almost 20 years. And they were looking to, see it redevelop in different ways. I mean, they had gone through several different iterations. And then just because you mentioned this, and I know I said Q&A, but I have to get one other thought out because I've mentioned this as a strategy for Burlington. And maybe it goes back to my first card, because I do think we have strong fundamentals, and we're not, on the 495 belt, we're not out in the outer areas. So we also hear well, these buildings are not going to be valued at all, and we're going to have to scrape them and redevelop them as housing. I've been saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, please, I welcome the challenge, is I still think that there's a lot of value in the location where Burlington sits, that we have 100 acres of essentially parking lot, and we talked a lot about this from our mixed use effort for the mall, but throughout the commercial corridor, there's easily 100 acres of parking and underutilized space in a lot of ways. Could we look at, infill first, allowing for different kinds of uses, be it residential, be it something else, that then supports smaller entities, these 20,000 Welches, to come in and continue to make it attractive? I'm just curious. And maybe Crosby, I'm going to toss it to you, because in some ways you've done that a little bit, right? Throughout Northwest Park.
Yeah, and it depends on the asset at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
That you have, and it depends on the location, but you're correct that there are some assets that there's great infrastructure to it, and it just needs a little bit of time, and you should be able to lease up at the end of the day. And the further away you get from those amenities, the older the build out becomes, right? So for a office building to be competitive, if that office space hasn't been renovated for 20 years, you probably have to spend $150 a square foot just to get it into a condition it's going to be competitive against the other assets. So kind of to your point, the farther that these assets fall into disrepair and fall behind other competition, the harder it is for it to pencil to be repurposed at the end of the day. But that's not to say that, every 4 or 5 story office building is in that case, that a lot of them, in Burlington, there's a lot of nice buildings that have been built, certainly the last 20 years, but the last 30 years. So for select assets, it's true. For others, it's, you have to run the numbers to see how much is it going to cost for me to get it into a position just to make it attractive for someone. So it really depends, but there are a lot of cases where it's reusable.
Thank you. Thank you. No, thank you for that. I think we could continue having this conversation, but I think we should probably turn it over here to some of the audience members. I know you were very kind. Some of you guys sent me questions. I hope I got to kind of weave those into this conversation. But are there other questions out there? I'll give you the microphone. And yes, well, I'll do Monty and then Barbara and then Jeremy.
Monty Pearson, I'm a member of Town Meeting's Land Use Committee. And we were talking about flexibility, and we were talking about reputation, and I was wondering, Burlington Town Meeting just passed a change of zoning that allowed for 2 former old office buildings over by Third Avenue, Third Avenue, to be converted into residential. Does something like that send a signal? I mean, we've talked about signals, and I don't know what a signal actually consists of. Is that a signal to the real estate community and other developers that Burlington is a place that's flexible, or is that just a shot in the dark?
Thank you, Monty. Michael, why don't you take that one?
It certainly sends a signal. But how publicized is that signal to the real estate community? And how efficient is that message getting out to not only prospective investors, developers, and landlords, not only within the community, but looking to get into the community? How well is that publicized? I think that's really the question. And I don't think it's been very well publicized to the greater Boston real estate community.
And Michael, if we want to publicize it, I think that has been a question. Sandy.
Yeah, I just also want to add, I think it's great that you did that. I don't know the backstory, but if that's something that took a really long time and was a very hard-fought battle, it sends a different signal than if it was a really well-run process and it went through kind of the first time through, right? Because developers are looking for places where they can get stuff done, because the longer the process is, the more it costs. And town meeting processes in general are viewed in the development community as very risky. So publicizing that it was done, I think, is super important, but also knowing that, I hate to say it, but how easy it is for somebody to get it through really does matter.
Chris.
On that a little bit as well. A conversion from a commercial to a residential space isn't necessarily going to catch the radar screen for site selectors or for corporations. However, Sandy, to your point, if there's been a dispute about a change of land use, that will get their attention. That's the kind of thing that's going to show up in a news search. Just kind of taking that one more step, though, to the extent that you can anticipate the kinds of uses you want to have next and anticipate the things that they are likely to need and to be able to smooth the path for them. One of the big differentiators that you can make for yourself as a community right now is to have a clear, transparent, and predictable process for bringing that use in. So the more that you can understand the needs of the kinds of uses that you're trying to bring and have the infrastructure, the teams, and the regulations that anticipate it, then you're going to be very much better positioned.
So Monty, I think what Monty's bringing up is a good question, because what is happening here a little bit in Burlington has been projects that come out of maybe the town planning process that they would never typically push forward. So I think it's a little different in that way. You know, how should we respond to projects that do come out of, you know, from the developer or outside the town planning process? And I think we will circle back to that, but in the interest of getting to a few more questions, I'll keep this moving along.
Thank you. Barbara LaRue with Planning Board. I have a question, but I also wanted to comment on, just quickly on what Monty said. Yes, it does send a signal. There's another developer that is putting forward a zoning request to change to residential. It's going to come to town meeting possibly in May. Might not make it for May, maybe in September. And in our discussions with them, they did refer to that other zoning request. So yes, it sent a signal, and yes, it's still happening. My question is a little complicated. Yes, we all know that everybody wants to build housing right now, and Burlington has actually done a lot of zoning changes in the last year and a half, allowing for housing in areas that did not allow for housing previously. We also know that right now, Burlington has about 2/3 of its taxes paid by the commercial base. There has to be a tipping point, and I'm not exactly sure where that is, because if we continue to rezone commercial property to residential, that property then gets taxed at a residential rate, not at a business rate. And once it turns to residential, it will never again go back and will never again be taxed at that commercial rate. So we need to be careful. Yes, we all know there's a need for housing, and there are benefits to having housing in the same space as commercial. But we also have to be careful that we don't zone so much of our property to housing that we upset that balance, and we no longer have that 2/3, 1/3 balance. I'm not sure where that
Is there
tipping
a
point is.
question on?
I don't know where the tipping
the
point is.
tipping point. So that is a really good question that has come up. And I think through this process, like we said, it was the beginning of the conversation. And through the town administrator, we had already started talking about also having maybe a tax summit, because there's a lot of layers to kind of the taxing process, the balance, the split, you know, the levy capacity, not taxing to the levy capacity. And, you know, I know Greg Ryan's been also bringing that up in through discussion. So I think there's more to come. If there another question on that?
Really quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't we get Welch's? I'm dying to know, and I think it would be important for us to understand why we didn't get Welch's.
Okay, so you need your microphone. Okay.
So I was part of the team that did represent Welch's. I think what it ultimately came down to for them, and again, every tenant that runs a process is very individual for that particular company, for that particular tenant, for their particular needs at that particular time. And a single tenant can have several different processes over a period of 5 years that become kind of the tipping points. For them, ultimately they wanted a couple things. One, brand signage on 128. That came about late. And two, from an employee demographic, existing employee demographics, for their employee base that resided in Concord, the least disruptive relocation, which ultimately it put them at the intersection of I-95 and Trapello Road. Hence why they ended up at 1601 Trapello Road. So it had nothing to do with the town, and Crosby's team put together a fantastic package. Ultimately, they chose Waltham over Burlington, which usually is the case when you get into a competitive environment in Burlington. It's Burlington versus Waltham. You kind of skip over Lexington for some other reasons, but those are the two areas.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think one thing that you said that earlier is really having those conversations with the brokerage community. I know we're about to transition to some solution conversations, but I know, Jeremy, you had a question.
Hi, Jeremy Harrington from the Planning Board. I have a question that starts rooted in restaurants and probably has two different answers from different perspectives. And so the first is, I know our restaurant community is important. It's one of the amenities we want, and that attracts other commercial uses, but the staff of the restaurants don't live near here. Transportation is an issue, and one of our gaps is, as we all know, is middle housing. So the question becomes, probably for Sandy, how do we activate and convince developers to not build $2 million homes, to not build high-end apartments, but incent them to develop that middle housing? That feeds the restaurants. And then on the other side, the Class A and the definition of what people view as Class A, I think is starting to change as we have more work from home, people are more AI focused, and they're doing more work with less people. So the amount of people per work is going down. We're getting more efficient. How do we think about where Class A is going to be in a few years to tie into those restaurants and amenities to attract companies? Like you said, whale hunting. We'll probably have less whales. We probably have smaller footprints of associates. Where are we going from your perspective on that Class A in 5 or 10 years so we can start thinking about the zoning? So there's the middle housing, and then there's the other end about the commercial side.
Thank you, Jeremy. So, Sandy, do you want to take the middle housing? Because we have done some zoning work on that.
I would say it's really one word. It's subsidy. You got to figure out how to subsidize the middle housing, because the economics of housing today, with construction cost and land cost, it just doesn't work for anything other than market rate. And I always say that luxury housing is delivered by market rate developers because that's what they can deliver. And it's luxury based on whatever is the price point in the town. It's always, with the newest stuff, is always going to be the most expensive thing because it cost the most money to deliver. But there are creative subsidies, right? There are TIFs that are available for housing, and my accounting professor back in business school said you get what you measure, you get what you incent. Yeah. So if you really want to provide that workforce housing, think creatively. Like you just talked about all of these parking lots. Maybe there's some kind of, think like a ski town. They put all the parking together and they shuttle people over. Is there something you can do like that relative to housing, relative to where the core places are? So it's a lot of thinking outside the box, but it really comes down to subsidy.
Thank you, Sandy. And then the other question on Class A office and where it's going. And did I get that right, roughly? Who would like to take that?
I can jump in, you can correct me. I think your assessment of smaller chunks of space on average, I think is correct, that I think you're gonna see, and this is a little bit of a limb, but on the AI world, I think you're gonna see smaller, newer, nimbler companies come out of that. And I think there's less larger corporate requirements. I don't think they just dissolve, but I think it is smaller chunk spaces. I'm not sure I see a radical change. I think there's certainly a gravity towards amenities and amenitized locations. But I think people are still going to be hungry for, a nice lower price point deal, and there are going to be those that are going to be looking for the Class A higher suite of amenities. So I'm not sure I see that world changing so drastically.
And I agree with that. The one thing that I would say that I think is going to continue to change, and it has changed a lot in the last 5 years, it's how a space works for a particular tenant. What's inside it? What does it entail? Does it capture a brand? Does it capture a culture? Does it foster collaboration, collision, animosity? But, I remember the tour we went through the VMware space, and I was blown away because I didn't think an office would ever look like that. But that works for that culture. So I think to paint a brush of a across the board is impossible to do, because I do think brand culture within organizations is only going to continue to become more important to get that workforce back to the office. So I think it's evolving is the right answer. And for somebody to say what that's going to be in 5 years, I think they would be categorically wrong. But I think everyone's obviously owners and tenants are well far ahead of the game as it relates to the interior of the space.
Yeah, that was the other prop I was going to bring, the crystal ball. Just left that one at home. Because I think no one knows. I mean, the AI piece, we haven't really even dived into that, but the idea of shrinking in terms of the workforce already shrinking, you have the remote work. We know that, Crosby and I were on a panel for M3. There are companies that put certain systems inside their office to see what spaces are being used and which ones, so when they renew or when they're doing something different with their lease, they don't need X space, or the collaboration space is getting, really hot. So there's even technology being used to understand the real estate itself. So I think I had another question here from Brenda.
Brenda Rappaport, Planning Board. So it's my understanding, and I'm not a professional in tax anything, but in 2024, the commercial to residential conversion was noted under the Mass Affordable Homes Act. So owners are receiving up to 25% tax credit from if they convert commercial to residential. You noted tax incentives and subsidies. What else would you recommend? Because I feel like 25% is kind of a good chunk of change.
It's not enough. I'm just going to be really honest, right? So I worked on a very large project in Malden. It was a 320-unit project. We got a 20-year, 100% residential tax abatement. It was valued at $9.3 million. This is about 6 or 8 years ago. So, at that time, the per unit tax in Malden was about $2,400. So you could double that today for a project of a similar scale, so a pretty large project. And $20 million sounds like a lot of money, but you guys have done, I'm looking at Crosby, because you guys have built some residential.
How many units was that, Sandy?
That was a 320-unit project. In that case, there were still retail taxes that went to the city, and it was city-owned land, so it went from having no taxes to having some, and with punting the bulk of it. But 25% does sound like a lot, but when you're running the numbers on a deal, it goes back to what you said. It's not enough to make the difference of penciling. And I'll point back to this project that I just noted, that Somerville did, which literally I learned about at a lunch this afternoon, and they said that Somerville did that project and gave them the abatement that they gave them because of the affordability component in the project. But it was really creative, right? And not a lot of stuff is getting done today. And you guys know that stuff is not coming out of the ground on the housing side because the numbers are not working. So, and I'll also say, having, as a developer, asking developers to come in and literally show you their numbers and coming to that with an open mind of help me understand what you need, then you can work the problem, as opposed to oftentimes people get their back up at on both sides of the table of, well, we need the moon and we don't want to give you anything. So if you can really change that dynamic, and it goes to the flexibility and the reputation, if people get the sense of, I can get a deal done in Burlington because they are open to being creative, there's a lot of ways to be creative. And the tax piece is one, figuring out other sources of subsidy from your affordable housing trust or other ways, figuring out parking relief or shared parking when things are co-located, and really diving in on some of that. There's lots of thought.
Thank you, Sandy. Yes, again, beginning of the conversation. So, and we'll get into, kind of working and thinking how we can maybe target sites or target initiatives around that. We have 2 more questions, and then we will transition a little bit more of the problem-solving conversation.
Hello, Cheyenne Bhattacharya, Ways and Means. So as far as converting a lot of these buildings that are commercial spaces to residential spaces, a point was made about the tax balance that we need to maintain in order to keep the majority of our tax revenue commercial. Would it make more sense to, if we're converting the buildings anyway, to convert them for the necessary power demands and infrastructure of AI data centers that would keep them commercial, keep those spaces occupied, potentially with long-term leases, and not have to go through converting them to a residential building?
I'm going to try to grab a little bit of that.
Yeah, thank you.
First of all, data centers aren't permitted in town. And there's a lot of talk out there in the industry about the power capacity that they draw and how it takes away from other things that you could be doing. But I wanted to tie it back to Barbara's question, because that's the million-dollar question. If we convert commercial space to residential, it's taxed at a lower rate. If we don't, and the commercial valuations of the commercial buildings, they stay empty and depreciate, that's not good either. So there's got to be a balance, and certainly if I had the answer to that one, I'd be much smarter than I am. But there has to be some give there. I mean, if you have a property where they're adding residential to commercial and you're not losing anything, that's ideal, but that doesn't exist everywhere. So you have to be open to it. And I just wanted to tie it back. You mentioned Third Ave and the district being examples of what we do to be flexible and go forward. I'll add one other, and I'm not talking about the mixed-use zoning, but I'm talking previously what we've done with the mall. They came to us years ago, and I was on town meeting at the time asking for liquor licenses, anticipating that online shopping was going to have a real dent in what malls could do. And getting liquor licenses there, getting some of the zoning for experiential things. Without that, that mall would be in the same shape as some of the other malls that are in the area. And I know that it's kind of a sticking point. Hey, we don't want to be known for the mall. They're a #1 taxpayer. That's a vibrant mall. It's one of the best malls in New England. So I think being flexible and seeing the picture, and I know when we all went through it, we couldn't see the end. We were just seeing change, and it was scary. But if we hadn't done that, that mall's valuation would have gone down dramatically. So there is a balance between doing too much and doing nothing. And somewhere in between, we'll find the solution.
Thank you, Rick. And I did have one more question here, and then we were going to transition.
Thank you. Excuse me. Roger Bell, I'm a town meeting member. So this is really two parts. Number one, on the real estate side. For a while, we had the life sciences was really driving what the field needed, and we were accommodating as much as we could. Is there a different trend on the business side, and is our business model for how we're operating to challenge that kind of trend? Are you seeing something that will change how we're doing, how we're making our business model on the real estate side? Or is it staying, or is it just completely competitive, and that's the way it's going to be?
Again, you brought up a point with life science, and again, life science caught fire based upon a global pandemic, which there was a lot of funds that have been raised to invest in life science. The release of those funds and investment into those companies just happened sooner based upon the pandemic, which ultimately, if you look at it, always have approximately 2 million square feet of life science demand at any given time in Greater Boston historically. Hadn't been a large market. Pandemic hits, everybody's getting a ton of funding. That grew to 7.7 million square feet over about a 4-month time frame. So as developers, landlords, towns look at it and said, oh my God, there's all this demand, nowhere to put it. And ultimately, that caused a boom. And towns like Burlington were very accommodating to reposition some of the assets, 3 Van de Graaff, 3 Burlington Woods, 5 Burlington Woods. Crosby was very successful at Blue Sky with the development, 2 commitments, Vericel Road, and a handful of others. Some others weren't so successful. But since then, that was a period of time that not a lot of people in the life science game like to think about. But to answer your question, from a business standpoint, right, I think it is falling back on, from a real estate perspective, the strong fundamentals we have, and perhaps a little bit more publicity, because that's something that has worked in the past, and we've seen just from general marketing campaigns, to get the word out, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy. It should just be done a little bit more.
Well, that leads into my next question. As a town, and with our working with the business community, how are we actually marketing Burlington to help drive whatever our needs are for the future?
That's a good question. We started out by really kind of creating more of an online presence. So we did not have a website, so we started a website. We did not have a social media site, so we had a social media. And we have used marketing as destination-based marketing, so pulling it in for Burlington itself, not necessarily looking at one specific thing, and then showcasing kind of the different industry clusters and things like that. There is a lot of work that can be done. I even heard this evening some things that we can be a little more proactive about. In the past, we've done shuttle buses to tour brokers around and kind of court them a little bit more. Chris, you're shaking your head. Are there a couple other things? Maybe this is a good question to kind of turn back to our panelists, if you don't mind. I can continue that conversation, but just so we have everyone here and we can hear people's kind of last minute thoughts, because as you guys know, part of what we wanted to do is really kind of think about with our local leaders here in town, couple sentences each on what you think the town should lean into, or where should they focus over the next 1 to 3 years. I'm saying a little bit more short term. If you have a long-term idea, you just say that. Thank you. And why don't we start with Crosby?
I look at the stats that Michael has up there and agree with your synopsis at the beginning that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with Burlington. And I think everyone in this room advocates highly for everything that is in this town and the people, the business community, the residents. And what those numbers reflect is it's a supply-demand imbalance. It's not a flaw in the structure. It's not a flaw in the infrastructure. And real estate just goes through cycles. And so this is a supply and demand issue. And there's too much of this office supply. And if you go through history, there are plenty of asset classes that have gotten transformed or redeveloped over time. And so this is really, you see the renewals coming up with the expirations, and it's about capturing, keeping those tenants in the business community. But it's also, you don't go back to 90%, 95% occupancy without bringing people in, right? You need net leasing. So it's going out,
Net leases,
finding those businesses. Sorry, Waltham, but going to Waltham and who's expiring in the next 3 years, we want you to come to Burlington. You tell us what to do, and we'll find you the space, and we will get you into the town of Burlington. And so I think it's that proactive approach. It's bringing people in. And to the question of, is what uses and industries are we pursuing that if you look through time, Northwest Park used to be a pig farm and a quarry way back when. It went through defense contractor spending, and it all got converted into office, then it got turned into data centers, believe it or not, during the dot-com bust, and then it got converted into makerspace. But all of those trades involve an intellectual hub. So I think a big thing for us is how do we host more intellectual centers in the town? Northeastern has a campus. We'd love to host events at Blue Sky, get people into town, because one thing that all of these industries have in common is an intellectual base. These companies are coming out of MIT, they're coming out of Harvard, they incubate, and then they need space. So how are we showing them proactively, in discussion with a couple groups, of hosting free events, networking for these industries that are growing, and life science. It pivoted a little bit to the clean tech energy, and now that funding has come down, but now you have the AI. So you see these cycles come and go, but it's the talent that these companies want. So how do you get the talent here and recognizing as a real talent pool?
Thank you, Crosby. I'm taking notes. Sandy.
I don't want to follow Crosby. No, I mean, you just said so many great
Right,
things.
right.
I was sitting here thinking, okay, well, some of these commercial spaces, what if they became workforce development? So truthfully, as part of thinking about the long term, which is what I really think you should be doing in the next 1 to 3 years, like really thinking, where do you want to be 10 years from now? It's gathering people like this in a room to talk about what could we do. And I would also say, you know, Rick, you gave a great answer to the question around the tax piece and the
You got that down on great answer?
don't get hung up on what it is today, right? Like the whole, every town is talking about the loss of the commercial tax base. But if you get hung up on that and let the current state of affairs or the state of affairs 5 years from now be, or 5 years ago, be your kind of nirvana, you're going to completely miss the boat of what's going to happen next. So businesses want to be around other thriving businesses. And so you want as much of your business space to be thriving. And so having less space that's really successful is better than having more space that's vacant. So really thinking about that, and I would say being open-minded is like the number one value you should bring to any of the conversations, because it enables the conversation to be explorative. And that's how you're going to get to being the best place to do business in 2036.
Thank you, Sandy. Rick.
I think it's great that we're in this building tonight. A long time ago, people met here, maybe farmers, and they said, the U.S. Highway Department is connecting all the states. We're going to have this 128 coming through Burlington. How are we going to protect our industry here? Because they're going to have big farms out in the central part of the country and be able to get it out here. They talked about it. I don't know what they planned. I wasn't at that meeting. But Burlington has a history of being resilient. I mean, you just look at this building itself was part of a three-way land swap that if anyone was to say this is going to be an easy thing, it wasn't. But we saw the need for the project, and we made it happen. I think we all just have to be on the same page going forward, understanding we've had it good for a long time, and we're competing against other municipalities that have struggled for a long time. And they want to get the benefit of, our neighbors want to get the benefit of Burlington's amenities while locating in another municipality. We're all going to have the traffic. If you don't have the destination in your municipality, you're missing that commercial tax base. And that's what we've really got to strive to work together as a team, from every board in town to the chamber to Melissa's office, to be on that same team, to make sure that if there's something, the next big thing that's good for us, that we absolutely are going to be a part of it. So I think we've got a good history of being able to do that.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. Chris, what can our leaders listening to you? Wise words from Chris Steele.
Okay, play that up. I appreciate it. I'm actually going to restate something that Crosby said, but in a slightly different way, which is we are absolutely in a point of transition within this marketplace. So we can actually look at this as an opportunity to try and actually figure out how we want to reframe, reposition for what might come next. In order to do that, we need to be able to take a look at the data that's out there as to what the next things might be, which of those we want as part of our community, be selective about it, but for the things that we do want, to understand what their needs are likely to be, both in terms of infrastructure, in terms of workforce, as well as to anticipate what their needs are going to be. Now, there's a very specific reason why I put that up that way. When life sciences was really starting to take off, every municipality, all 351 of them here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts said, we want to have life sciences, we want to have biotech, we want to have life sciences. I am part of the biotech cluster. Bless your heart. A lot of them didn't actually then go back and investigate what that meant. So they had regulation that prohibited a lot of the things that were core functions of biotech. As they started to understand what biotech was, they recognized, oh, geez, and they would do this in front of town, oh, geez, we don't want that actually part of our community. So they didn't actually take the time to understand what the opportunities were, and they bandwagoned. We have the luxury of time now to be able to think strategically and to be able to put all of the patterns in place that we need to be flexible as well as to be attractive to the things we want.
Thank you, Chris. Michael, your turn.
Yeah, everybody has said everything that I was going to say. But again, it comes down to it. Burlington's a fantastic destination. I think you really put yourself on the map more so in the last upswing than you have in the past. So you can build on the success that you've had with the fundamentals and the infrastructure and proactivity that you have today. It's not easy. Change is always hard. I've always said in the real estate community that the greater Boston suburban market is the most under-demolished market, primary market in the United States. And that's true if you look at the age of the buildings. Things change, and that's okay. It doesn't mean it's not going to be successful. It just means it's going to be a period of time until the next thing comes along. But a green shoot for greater Boston, which I think is going to parlay into what Burlington has to offer. Greater Boston typically lags the New York City and Bay Area office markets. Some say it's approximately 12 months to New York City. I think it's a little bit longer. Bay Area changes, but the Bay Area is pretty similar demographic employer base there. But if you look at New York City is surpassing pre-pandemic levels from a leasing velocity standpoint, historically high rents. Again, different animal. But then you have the Bay Area. Bay Area, I think in the fourth quarter of 2025 alone, talked about AI. The space takedown of these AI companies is significant. And it's only a matter of time, given what I think the strong suit of the Commonwealth is, which access to intellectual capital. It's only a matter of time until that starts to take off here. Whether that's 9/18, maybe it'll dovetail more into the Class A office of the future. I don't know, but it's only a matter of time before that starts to take off here.
Thank you, Michael. I just probably want to bring it all back a little bit because I don't think it's probably one thing or the next big thing. I will probably say, having given my time through seeing things, it is not just a silver bullet of one zoning change, one industry to chase. So it's multifaceted, and I think the theme we've heard throughout the night is Burlington is in a strong position. Sandy, you were giving me vibes of the Wayne Gretzky philosophy. You play to where the puck's going to be, not where it's at. So that's where you want to kind of go and think like that. It is harder, and sometimes you're going to make mistakes, and it's a little scary. I understand that, especially as a community, trying to find that out. But in terms of actionable items, I noted a few things and themes around, marketing, networking, and different communities that we can be part of. And that's kind of some short-term thinking. And then with the administration, we've already talked about doing 2 more summits on small business and taxes, so that you'll be looking forward to those things to have a similar conversation that gets a little bit more granular on that end too. But with that said, I think we'll conclude. We're just over our time. And I want, if everyone here could give our panelists a big round of applause. Thank you guys so much. And we'll conclude tonight.